It's one of the most chilling crimes in modern British history, a crime so shocking it left the nation reeling and wondering. How could two 10-year-old boys commit such a horrific act? The murder of 2-year-old James Bulger by Robert Thompson and John Venables in 1993 has haunted many for decades. The brutal nature of the crime, the young age of the perpetrators, and the unimaginable pain it caused his family have kept this tragedy in the public's mind ever since. But perhaps the most disturbing part of it all is the question that still lingers. What led to this tragedy? How could two children, just a few years older than the victim, turn into killers? Was it a moment of madness, or were there deeper, darker influences at play? This case continues to puzzle experts, stir debates, and raise uncomfortable questions about childhood, innocence, and the capacity for violence. In this video, we'll explore the shocking details of the crime, the investigation that followed, and the lasting impact it had on everyone involved. The story of James Bulger, Robert Thompson, and John Venables is one that still echoes today, a painful reminder of how something so unimaginable can happen in the most unexpected of circumstances. On February 12, 1993, in the quiet streets of Bootle, Liverpool, two innocent lives would be forever linked in a tragic and unimaginable way. James Bulger, a 2-year-old boy, was with his mother Denise at a local shopping center. What should have been an ordinary day quickly turned into a nightmare. That afternoon, James was abducted by two boys, Robert Thompson and John Venables, both just 10 years old. What followed was beyond comprehension. The two boys led James away from the shopping center, and in a series of horrifying events, they took his life in the most brutal way. James Bulger's murder at the hands of these young children shocked the world. It wasn't just the crime itself that left people speechless, but the fact that it was committed by children so young. And that, to me, the tragedy would go on to become one of the most infamous crimes in British history, forever changing the way society viewed childhood, innocence, and the concept of criminal responsibility. The case raised difficult questions that continue to be debated today. How could this happen? And how should society deal with young offenders who commit such terrible acts? Innocence, issues that most people view with tremendous credibility, the case raised difficult questions that continue to be debated today. How could this happen? And how should society deal with young offenders who commit such terrible acts? Robert Thompson and John Venables, the two boys responsible for the murder of James Bulger, came from difficult and troubled backgrounds. They both grew up in the same working-class neighborhood of Bootle, a place marked by poverty and hardship. Though they weren't the stereotypical criminals society might expect, their lives were far from normal. Robert Thompson's home life was one of neglect. He came from a broken family with a history of emotional and physical abuse. He often struggled with his emotions, and his parents' relationship was unstable, creating an environment of chaos and confusion. John Venables, too, grew up in a difficult home. His parents were separated, and he faced problems at school and within his family. John's behavior at a young age was often described as troubling. He had a history of acting out and struggling to connect with others. Both boys were described as quiet and troubled children with a deep sense of isolation. They spent a lot of time alone, often seeking each other's company. Their friendship was built on shared experiences of hardship and neglect. Their home lives were far from ideal, and both boys were, in many ways, products of their environment, one where love, care, and stability were in short supply. To truly understand how these two boys ended up committing such a horrific act, we need to look at the difficult circumstances that shaped their childhoods. This background doesn't excuse what they did, but it helps explain the deep emotional turmoil they both faced long before the tragedy of February 12th, 1993. The day that would change everything began like any other. On that fateful afternoon in February 1993, Robert Thompson and John Venables were at the shopping center in the Strand in the town of Bootle. They were just two young boys walking around, bored, and looking for something to do. It was a normal day for them, with nothing out of the ordinary. But what happened next would take their lives, and the life of another, down a dark and tragic path. Around 3:40 p.m., while wandering through the shopping center, they spotted 2-year-old James Bulger, who was walking hand in hand with his mother, Denise. James was a toddler, innocent, and unaware of the danger that was about to come. Robert and John saw him, and in an instant, they made a decision that would change everything. What happened next was as sudden as it was horrifying. Without warning, they approached James, and in a matter of minutes, they led him away from his mother. It was an unthinkable act, one that would set off a chain of events no one could have predicted. James' mother, Denise, didn't realize what was happening until it was too late. The two boys, so young themselves, had already taken control of the situation, and from that moment on, James Bulger's fate was sealed. And after abducting James, the boys took him on a walk through the streets of Liverpool. In those chilling hours, they walked him away from the shopping center, across busy roads, and eventually to a secluded area near a railway line. What happened during that time remains some of the most disturbing details of the case. The two boys, with chilling indifference, tortured and ultimately killed James in a series of brutal acts. The details are graphic and hard to fathom, but it's important to understand what happened in those crucial moments to understand the depths of the horror that unfolded. As the hours passed, James's mother, Denise, became increasingly frantic. At first, she thought her son was simply lost, perhaps just wandering around the shopping center. But as time went on and there was still no sign of James, the reality of the situation began to sink in. She knew something was terribly wrong. Denise desperately searched the area, calling out for her son, asking for help. The minutes turned into hours, and with each passing moment, her fear grew. The police were soon called and the search intensified, but James was nowhere to be found. His mother's worst fears were becoming a reality. It wasn't until the following morning that the unimaginable happened. James's body was discovered by two children who were walking near the railway tracks, not far from where Robert and John had taken him hours before. The location where James's body was found, secluded and hidden away, shocked everyone. The brutality of the murder, the violence inflicted on such a young child, left the police and the public in disbelief. The fact that the killers were just 10 years old made the situation even harder to comprehend. The nation, already in shock, struggled to understand how such a horrifying act could be committed by children so young. The discovery of James's body was the devastating end to a heartbreaking search. But it was also the beginning of a nightmare that would haunt not just his family, but the entire country. This time, it was a dream come true. The investigation into James Bulger's disappearance was intense and exhaustive. The police worked around the clock, piecing together the details of what had happened. They interviewed witnesses, followed up on every lead, and combed through every piece of evidence they could find. It wasn't long before they discovered something crucial. CCTV footage from the shopping center showed two boys, Robert Thompson and John Venables, walking alongside James before his abduction. The interview was pretty bizarre, except for one particular point. When they're walking along, the footage was clear. It showed the two boys leading James away from his mother, heading toward the direction where they would later take him. This evidence was shocking, but it also led the police to a breakthrough. They soon identified Robert and John as the two boys seen in the video, and they were arrested. But even after their arrest, a haunting question remained: why did they do it? How could two young boys, just 10 years old, commit such an unimaginable act of violence? The police were left grappling with this mystery, trying to understand the motives behind the crime. What could have driven them to take a child's life? Was it a result of their troubled backgrounds? Or was there something deeper at play? The investigation had solved part of the puzzle, but it opened up many more questions that would take years to answer. The trial of Robert Thompson and John Venables in 1993 quickly became a media frenzy. The case was one of the most shocking examples of childhood crime that the public had ever seen. As the trial unfolded, the country was divided. Some believed that these boys, so young, were victims of their difficult upbringings, products of neglect, abuse, and a broken system. Others, however, saw them as simply evil, capable of committing a horrific crime with no regard for the life of an innocent child. The trial was traumatic for everyone involved, especially for James Bulger's parents, Denise and Ralph. They had to relive the nightmare of losing their son in a very public and painful way. Every detail of the case was aired for the world to see, and for James's family, it was an unimaginable ordeal. But perhaps the most chilling part of the trial was hearing the two boys' defense. Both Robert and John denied having planned the murder. They claimed that it was a spontaneous act, something that happened in the heat of the moment. But the evidence told a different story. The CCTV footage, the details of the abduction, and the violent acts that followed all pointed to a carefully executed plan. The defense's claim seemed at odds with the brutal reality of the crime, leaving many to question how two young boys could commit such a horrifying act with such cold precision. The detectives later exonerated themselves, having processed the situation and become cautious about details. As the trial continued, the unanswered questions grew. Why did they do it? Was it truly a moment of madness or something more? The court case may have provided some answers, but it also highlighted just how difficult it was to understand the depths of what had happened. The case of James Bulger's murder sparked an outcry that spread far beyond Liverpool. People across the UK and even the world struggled to come to terms with the fact that two children, just 10 years old, could commit such a heinous crime. The public reaction was divided, and the debate that followed was intense. Some believed that Robert Thompson and John Venables were victims themselves, victims of neglect, abuse, and a broken system. These people argued that, as children, the boys should be treated differently, that they could still be rehabilitated and given a chance to change. They believed that the circumstances of their lives had led them to commit such a terrible act, and that the focus should be on helping them rather than punishing them. Others, however, felt that the boys should be held fully accountable for their actions. The crime was so brutal and the violence so calculated that many believed the boys needed to face the consequences of their actions, regardless of their age. The idea that children could be capable of such cruelty challenged society's understanding of childhood innocence. For many, the case raised serious questions about justice and the need for punishment, even for those so young. The case also raised vital questions about the justice system. What happens when a child becomes a killer? Should children be treated as adults in cases of extreme violence? Or should they be protected by the understanding that they are still developing emotionally and psychologically? The debate over how to handle juvenile crime was never more urgent, and James Bulger's tragic death forced society to confront uncomfortable truths about childhood responsibility and the potential for violence in even the youngest minds. It sounded like what maybe was causing. In November 1993, Robert Thompson and John Venables were both found guilty of the murder of James Bulger. The verdict was a moment of relief for many, but it also sparked an intense debate about the fairness of their sentence. They were both sentenced to life in prison, but because they were only 10 years old at the time of the crime, many question whether it was right to treat them as adults. The age of the boys raised complex legal and moral issues Were they old enough to fully understand the consequences of their actions? Should their youth be taken into account when deciding their punishment? As the years went by, both Robert and John served their sentences in youth detention centers. They were kept in facilities designed for young offenders where they would receive education and therapy. Over time, both boys reportedly showed signs of rehabilitation, though many were skeptical of their chances for change. After serving just 8 years, they were released on parole, and their release came with conditions. Their new identities were kept secret to protect them from potential harm, and they were given a chance to rebuild their lives away from the public eye. The aim was to help them reintegrate into society and allow them to live without the burden of their past following them at every turn. However, their release did not bring peace to those affected by their crime. The family of James Bulger and many others struggled with the idea that the boys who had taken a child's life were now free. The question of whether they were truly rehabilitated and whether justice had been fully served remained a topic of controversy for years. For many, the pain of James's death never faded, and the boys' release continued to stir strong feelings of anger and disbelief. James Bulger's murder continues to have a profound impact on the British public, the legal system, and the way society views juvenile offenders. The case shocked the nation when it first happened, and its effects are still felt today. Criminologists and psychologists study the case to understand the psychology behind such extreme violence at such a young age. The crime has sparked ongoing debates about childhood violence, parental responsibility, and how the justice system should handle young offenders who commit horrific acts. The case has also raised questions about how we define innocence and how society can better protect children from harm. It challenged the idea of what children are capable of and what should happen when they commit crimes. It changed how people think about juvenile justice, and the legal system has evolved in some ways as a result of the discussions sparked by James's tragic death. But for James Bulger's family, especially his mother Denise, the pain of losing their son has never truly gone away. For decades, she has fought for justice, not just for James, but for greater awareness of the issues surrounding child murderers. Denise has worked tirelessly to bring attention to the lasting consequences of the crime and to ensure that James's memory is not forgotten. The case has left a permanent mark on the nation, and the questions it raised continue to challenge our understanding of justice, childhood, and the potential for violence. It's a painful reminder that some tragedies leave scars that never heal, and that the legacy of such a crime lingers long after the headlines fade. The story of Robert Thompson, John Venables, and James Bulger is one of unthinkable tragedy, one that has left a permanent scar on British society. It's a crime so horrific that it's hard to fully grasp how it could happen. 2 young boys, capable of such violence, took the life of an innocent child, forever changing the lives of everyone involved. Yet it also serves as a stark reminder of how children, shaped by their circumstances, upbringing, and environment, can sometimes commit acts of unimaginable violence. While there's no excuse for what happened, the tragedy of James Bulger raises uncomfortable questions about the factors that contribute to such behavior. It challenges us to think about how society, families, and communities can better protect children and prevent such horrors from happening in the future. The story of James's death is not one that can easily be forgotten. It continues to echo through the corridors of justice, raising difficult questions that have no simple answers. The impact of this crime is still felt today, and the pain for James Bulger's family will never go away. In the end, this tragedy reminds us all of the darkness that can exist in the world and the responsibility we all share in ensuring that such horrors are prevented for future generations. As we reflect on this heartbreaking story, it's important to remember the innocence lost, the family shattered, and the pain that continues to linger. James Bulger was only 2 years old when his life was taken in such a brutal way. His death left a hole in the hearts of those who loved him, and his memory is a constant reminder of how precious and fragile life truly is. End quote. And James's legacy lives on, not just in the pain of his family, but in the lessons we've learned from this tragedy, and in the difficult questions that remain unanswered. How could this have happened? What can be done to prevent such horrors in the future? These are questions that continue to haunt us. As we close this chapter, we are reminded that some stories never truly have an end. They leave us with more than just facts and figures. They leave us with sorrow, with confusion, and with a deep need to understand the complexities of human behavior, especially when it comes to the unthinkable actions of those still considered children. The story of James Bulger is one that will always make us pause and reflect on the darkness that can exist, even in the most innocent of places.